AWS credits for hosting, which can be really significant for startups that are bootstrapping. Anyways, even for the free plan, and a lot of early stage startups that qualify for the free Carta plan anyways to help them manage their cap tables, there's like $5,000 worth of free AWS credits for free. You can get $2,000 credits towards Airtable, a bunch of stuff like that. Deals with Pilot and Freshworks, all kinds of different providers. But yeah, I think you just go to carta.com/startupstack, and yeah, you can find out more about all the different offers from vendors or providers that focus specifically on helping startups.
That's awesome. Thanks, Jeff.
Yeah.
So as a unpaid fan of Carta, it's a great service. So I suggest everybody take a look at it. Let's jump into our presentation today. So we've got Garett Robertson from Empyrean Advisors. He's going to talk to us a bit about process. And Garett, if you don't mind just giving everyone a 30-second background on yourself before you jump into the slides. You should be able to share your presentation now. And then also, as you have questions during the presentation, please put them in the chat, and we can have some conversation there. And then Garett, if you are able to look at the chat, fantastic. Otherwise, when you're done with your slides, we'll be able to jump into the chat and start the Q&A. But other than that, Garett, yeah, please jump in with your background.
I'm just trying to figure out where my screen went. I have the slides pulled up.
Yeah, we can see
my other little menus disappeared on me. Okay, well, I'm not gonna be able to see the chat, so if any interesting questions pop up, go for it. Otherwise, I'll answer, or just speak out, and otherwise I'll just answer questions at the end as we get to them. But yeah, my name is Garett Robertson, and my company is Empyrean Advisors. I've presented here before a few months ago, if you guys, some of you may remember. But we basically do growth strategy advisory for companies more or less all over the world. I have an office in Dubai and Austria and small operations in Australia, and kind of headquartered here. And we've worked with companies in manufacturing, software, defense contracting, real estate, healthcare, you know, pretty industry agnostic, and have a pretty good idea about what it takes to grow a business. I myself started Empyrean in the wake of selling my previous company, which was a healthcare provider that I grew nationally, and was a two-time finalist for E&Y's Entrepreneur of the Year. And so more or less growth and scaling companies has been my life for the last 25 years. And that's what we do. So Taylor had asked us today to, and by the way, I should mention that I have a couple of guys that are sort of on my team with us today, Phil Walker and Scott Cutler. And today we are talking about process mapping and wireframing and kind of why it's important. I'd just like to give a shout out for Scott, because this is like his wheelhouse. He's done a lot of Six Sigma and process improvement for Fortune 500s and defense contractors, and really a real pro when it comes to this kind of stuff. And anyway, with that, I'll kind of jump in. Me and Taylor were talking the other day, and it came up, you know, like, what are some of the things that I see that really kind of like block companies in their ability to grow or to command a good valuation in their business and so on. And, you know, there's a lot of factors that really kind of play into that, but one really critical one that seems to be an inflection point that I often relate to organizational puberty in a way is your ability to really document and build process for your company. Within a company, there should be two processes that you know intimately, step by step, from start to finish, all the way through. The first is your sales cycle, like from the point you get how you find your leads, and then from that point, step by step, who wireframed out from where they go in your system all the way to the end, and when they're happy and they bought something from you, and you start retargeting them, right? You should have a wireframe mapping that. And the second one is really about your operation. It's more or less from raw materials to completed and sold product. Like, what are the steps that your company has to go through to build that value that it's going to deliver to the customer? The big problem is that a lot of companies that are trying to grow don't have that. And so, when you try to onboard an employee or someone else, even from a related business, their job descriptions are different. Accountability is different. What they know isn't to your expectation, and you're dropping them into your team and asking them to figure out how it all works. And having a good wireframe and process map is a way to onboard and train and hold people accountable to the tasks that are important for delivering value. Companies that do that well have a really easy time acquiring top talent and finding even talent that might not be top, but training them in a way that allows them to deliver top performance, so that they can get what you need. So there are several reasons that you should care about it, because ultimately then you can predict the quality of your care, or the quality of your product. I say care because we do a lot of healthcare work, but generally the quality of your product, right? Making it predictable and good quality. The cost to onboard employees is lower, and I would also mention that it's a significant contributor to retention. So if you happen to be in a high turnover business, having good documented processes that you can follow is a significant reducer in turnover. And then just generally standard compliance. If you don't have it, you're probably not going to go out of business, but you're definitely going to stall your growth. In your hockey curve, your hockey stick curve might not look like a hockey stick anymore. It might look like a really, really, really big Nike swoosh, if it ever makes it to the swoosh part. It makes kind of growing and scaling your business very, very difficult. So there are some steps that you generally need to follow. You need to agree upon and define your methodology and how you're going to create these steps and kind of work through your business, particularly what are the outcomes that you're really trying to, what is the value you're creating for your end customer, and step by step, how do you create it? So you want to assemble a team of the people in your organization that really know that well. Hopefully in a very small company, the CEO is very intimately involved in that. But basically any of your operations people should be there. You're going to want to sit down and have a brainstorming session to gather all the information you need, and then literally connect it like a giant wireframe, step by step. Once you have that, it sets you up very well to, on an ongoing basis, then analyze and see what's deficient, where your roadblocks are, where your backlogs are, and all these kinds of things, and then start driving performance improvement initiatives. And as you do that, you can kind of institutionalize those changes, and not only does it impact your bottom line and help you drive increased profits, but it also helps you have that system that allows you to scale your business in the first place and grow it to hopefully, turn you into that $1 billion company you always wanted to be. So as we've worked with so many different clients and so many different industries, the funny thing about this is that conceptually, it's very simple. Now, every one of you, when you sit down in your business, you're going to come up with your own unique spider web that honestly can be a little bit of a mess. I'm going to show you a case study that we did with one of our clients not too long ago, to just show you how spider webby that can be. So it'll all be unique, but the general parameters are all still there. So generally, this is a sample universal process. I'm going to go through this a few different times. But generally, you're going to start with some kind of a customer request. It's more or less the need that they have. You're going to determine their requirements. You're going to procure the resources, raw materials, labor, whatever it is that you need to actually build it. You're going to go through your steps. This is one box, but this really is the big part of the spider web. You're going to go through your steps to actually building that value. And then you'll have some kind of a check to see if the thing you built meets the requirements that you set. And then after that, you're going to see if the quality you delivered to the customer is actually what they needed. So like a really good example of this in the manufacturing world would be like if I was building toys and I built this awesome toy. I thought this toy was exactly what my customer needs. So I come up with the requirements. It's an action figure. His skin is blue. He's got a mask on. He's got a cape, whatever. And you drive it all the way through here, and you're going to check to make sure there's no defects in that plan. Now you take that product and you deliver it to your customer, and you realize, dude, I didn't want an action figure with blue skin. I wanted one with red. So now you have a queue to either replace that product line or develop a new product line, red action figure as an example. And then ultimately you deliver this value to your customer. And so these feedback loops are basically a QA, a quality assurance and quality inspection process that every company should have in their operations in one form or fashion. And so what this process then looks like, I gave you an example of sort of manufacturing, but if I was a healthcare provider, I have a new patient coming into my system, they're going to meet with case management, they're going to put together, I'm going to find out what their problem is and what kind of resources they need for treatment. I'm going to put the steps together in their care plan, and I'm going to check to see if I'm complying with that care plan. And then I'm going to see if that actually impacted and improved the health outcome for my patient. In the software, industry, I'm going to sit down, I'm going to build a product that I think is going to deliver that customer need. I'm going to get all my staff and computers and everything I need to actually go build it. I'm going to put together a big old project management Gantt chart, and we're going to start building it, putting it together. I'm going to check periodically to make sure that I'm meeting my requirements as I move along. And then ultimately I'm going to release that and see what my customer says about it, and if it actually met his needs or not. And if not, then I'm going to move into version 2 of it, And I guess my point going through this is that this model here is a very simplistic representation of something that's universally applicable to any business. And if you can sit down with your team and you can wireframe this, and I tell companies all the time, the first time you do this, you're probably going to create something crazy. This is not a matter of identifying every task that will ever need to be done in your business. I mentioned there's 2 critical pathways that you need, your sales and then your operations. But there's a million other tasks that your people in your business will be engaged in and doing. And the most important part is to track your critical pathway that's actually taking that value all the way through to your customer, making sure that you have this kind of wireframed out, so that you can, I'll get onto the next slide, which is the next step about KPIs. But the goal is to be able to understand what your people are doing, how you create value, and really measure productivity versus busyness. Like, a lot of people can be busy, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're generating value. So you want to create this process flow and then identify how it can create actual productivity that you can track to. So that's the next slide is talking about not tracking everything, but after you build your wireframe, tracking the most important things. So you're going to look for backlogs, supply shortages, general difficulties, particularly difficult process steps, things like this. And you want to track stuff about that so that you can know if you're meeting your expectation or staying on track or not. Some examples might be right up at the front end on your inputs. It might be stuff like labor cost, labor materials, how much of each you need, quantities, stuff like that, right? As you get into your production, you might look at things like backlogs, number of productive hours worked versus total hours worked, throughput numbers like number of widgets produced, versus capacity, things like this to just kind of see how things are moving through so you can identify backlogs. A compliance check. This is going to be looking generally for like defects in the production, like, did the service that I built, whether I'm a marketing agency, did the service that I told my client I was going to deliver actually generate the number of leads they wanted of the quality they wanted? Did the toy that I make meet the specifications of my initial requirements? Did I check off all the boxes on the features that my software was supposed to be built to, and does it work? Is it buggy? And then, so you'll be checking things like that. And then ultimately back here, quality assurance can be a little bit more subjective, but it might be things like returns from your customer. It might be satisfaction scores on what they like and things like this. It might be other information or whatever, but you're just trying to track then the customer sentiment towards your deliverable and your product. And then ultimately your final output. And this could include your actual profits. Accounting measures. I'm a CFO, but it's kind of interesting when I go through this this methodology here with a lot of people, the fact is they all want to think that profits are actually somewhere over here in the process, and I'm tracking financial measures because they're here. But the reality is that financial measures only occur after everything is done. So it's great to kind of double check and, cash that paycheck and say fantastic. But you can actually predict your profits based off of how well all this other stuff is working. And so another reason why we want to track those critical pathways. So at a high level, you're going to build a process map and a wireframe of your whole operations. Once you have that, you're going to really identify your critical pathways. And then you're going to create some KPIs that help you measure the success of your critical pathways. This is a real life case study about a company that was trying to scale and failing at it. This is a healthcare provider back east with 35 locations. And as they were trying to grow, they had obviously grown to 35 locations and done pretty well for themselves, but their customer feedback was horrendous. The care in a number of the locations was terrible. And a lot of the issues, it just wasn't going well. It was a really sloppy organization. We got in there and we started wireframing, and over here on the left, this is an example of the wireframes they had across their organization. And in this organization, which had achieved a level of scale, but they couldn't grow. They were totally stalled out, stuck, and had been for years. They had, in the course of a patient coming to them and saying, I need help, to the point where they left their system, there was the possibility of 65,000 touch points with various individuals in the organization. Think about that. Like you're hopefully, if you're going to get medical treatment, you're hoping you're going to meet with your care provider, and that's about it, really. Maybe a nurse, maybe a receptionist. But like they literally had this system built out in a way that it was just a spider web of 65,000 touch points. And because they hadn't wireframed early on and done this, this is what it grew into over time. It started out as something simplistic, and over about a period of about 10 years, it turned into this monstrosity that couldn't function. So we got in there and broke it down. And after we were done, you can see the steps in the after picture moving along through it. And as we kind of iterated and broke it down and realized it, that one over there on the far right, that is their critical pathway. So out of this giant spider web of 65,000 touch points, they have this little tiny thing embedded and hidden somewhere inside of there, right? So when you get in and wireframe it, like if you're trying to train your employees to scale, would you rather be throwing them into this big old thing here and hoping that they just succeed? Or would you rather having them follow this thing over here on the far right with like a handful of steps and touch points? The fact is when they did this, their customer satisfaction spiked almost immediately. And the problems that they had with a number of referral partners evaporated within 3 months. And they've been doing really well ever since. But this is kind of an example of where your lack of process and your lack of documentation of process really leads to a major problem that you can't scale with. And when you wireframe it and take that time to break it down, you all of a sudden realize how simple your product could be and how easy it is to kind of break out of that Nike swoosh and turn into a hockey stick. So as a real practical example, this is reality, and I hope none of you end up with a business that looks like this one, but it's a reality. So take your time to do your process mapping and drawing out your wireframes, and you'll have a very successful time reaching this one over here. So that's really about it. Thank you for the few minutes and the opportunity to share some of my experiences, and I guess that we're open for questions and comments.
Awesome. Thanks, Garett. There have been a few questions and comments. I'm throwing in my questions to the chat, and if anybody else wants to, that's fantastic. But one of the questions that came up in my mind first, Garett, is how do you optimize your processes after you've documented them? Scott Cutler mentioned there are ways to differentiate between value add and non-value add activities. I'd just love to know, after I've mapped something, what's the best next step to optimize that process?
Well, I'll actually let Scott have a chance to talk a little on this because it's like his wheelhouse. But generally speaking, you're going to take your critical tasks and hopefully you're measuring them. and you can use some methodologies to kind of improve from there. But I'll let Scott maybe answer a little bit more from his experience on that.
Yeah, thanks, Garrett. I honestly don't have much prepared. There's stuff that I could pull up, but it was just too short a notice for me. But to answer the question about value add versus non-value add, there's a lot of stuff out there in the body of knowledge, in the lean training or lean implementation. And lean is basically just, to simplify it, it's basically just identifying non-value added activities or waste and just trying to eliminate waste in your process. So when it comes to Garett's wireframes, you can do very simple things like identify boxes that are process steps that people do, but maybe they don't add any value. And by value, it's really think in terms of 3 C's. The customer cares about it, it's done correctly the first time, and it changes a product. It adds some sort of change that adds value or something the customer cares about. Anyway, I mean, I could probably go on for longer than you guys care about, but there's training, there's online learning management systems that have very inexpensive, like $12 per person per month type platforms where you can log into and get access to tens of thousands of training modules. There's spreadsheet tools that can be found on the internet. I have a lot of custom tools. They're too complex to go into right now, but there's a lot of stuff out there. Hopefully that answered it, Garrett.
Yeah, that was a good summary. But yeah, there's a lot of tools available, as he said, and generally you're just trying to, I think there's a lot of statistical methodologies that are pretty robust that ultimately you could use. But the idea is basically being able to track important ideas and say, is this important and is it doing to my expectation? And perhaps like the biggest piece of advice I give to anyone on there is the notion of hypothesis testing. Because most of the time you first build your wireframe, you actually don't know what to expect with it. Unless it's a machine where you have a very definite output that's, attached with it, like a manufacturing company or something. So you go into it and say, well, how many hours should my person be doing that task? How many, what percentage of the time should do this? So you start out with an assumption. You start out saying, I think that particular step that's been a problem for me is going to take this much time for my person. Test it and track it, benchmark it. Did you beat it? Did you exceed it? Did you suck compared to it? And from that basis, you can start driving the insights you need to kind of change and tweak those processes.
Here's one piece of information that I've used too when even starting these processes, because my experience is that people that are very particular about wanting to get a process right get lost in the, like, hey, we need to document and define the process on this thing and make it better. They get immediately lost in the details. Like Scott and Garrett are experts at kind of working their way through these things and digesting them, but not everybody really is good at kind of seeing the big picture and the detail at the same time. So one of the pieces of advice that I'd use is, and I call it like the 5-box process. It's like, if you can't define kind of how something works in approximately 5 boxes at a high level, and Garrett kind of highlighted that with his nice picture, and his was what, 7 boxes? It's about right. Like somebody kicks something off, somebody does something, somebody validates that, and if you can't kind of summarize it, if you're already in the details, you need to kind of sometimes get back to that big picture and just get your head around, how does this thing kind of at a high level supposed to work? Then we can tweak out all the details. But if you don't have that nice high picture of it kind of goes from here to here to here to here, then you're going to get lost trying to even understand the details of your process.
Right. That's kind of like
one of the simplest things there is I just ask why. If you keep asking why, and someone who's doing a process and you say why, if they can't answer like what's the value to the customer or what's the value to the team or how it makes something easier, then that's right away, it's a red flag, and it shouldn't even go on your map, because a lot of people have cool ideas. It might be, well, because I want visibility. Like, I want people to see my big deals, so that's why I put it in the CRM. No, like, does it actually add value? Why? What are we doing this for?
Yeah, that's a good question to ask too. We do that quite. I mean, it's part of the root cause analysis. If there's a training that anybody could look up and just kind of like watch a YouTube video on or something, or you can talk to me or Scott or Phil about it, just look up the term root cause analysis. Read a little bit about that, and you'll understand a really good way of asking the whys to trace it back to a root cause of the issue. So.
One that I saw in the chat is how to get started. So I'm wondering if you were to give one of your clients or a customer the first 3 steps that they should do with the right tool, like just the simple saying, okay,
yeah,
open up,
honestly,
start, or whatever it is, what tools would you suggest? And Phil, how would you go about that 5-box?
So right at the start, pen and paper. Honestly, pen, paper, and interviews. Do not complicate life. At some point, you'll bring on a tool to help you kind of wireframe it and build it out, whatever. But you are trying to, at the very base as a CEO, create a process. And as your company has grown and tweaked and whatever, you may or may not have a good idea about what all those steps are. And what you need is a hypothesis. You need something that you can put together and say, I think it works like this. Let's go and see if it does. And so you start with a pen and your paper, document out what you think it is, maybe do it with your executive team, whatever, and then go to your frontline staff one by one and interview them. And go through those steps on your hypothesis and interview and see, okay, what complexities on that step do I need to elaborate more? Is it accurate? Do I need to change it? Am I like way off altogether? You'd be surprised at how often that happens, as is the case with the company I showed you guys as an example. They were way off from what they thought was actually happening.
Well, and I can totally validate that. How many times I've said, like Garett said, the executive team or a team said, okay, this is how we think it works. And we've talked to our teams. And then you literally draw out those 5 boxes or 7, the simple process, and you put it in front of someone and say, this is how we think it works. Is this how you think it works? And most of the time they're like, no, between 2 and 3, I go and print this thing out and I circle these things and I hand them to Bob. Oh, okay. And every time you'll find that there's somebody on the team who's like, yeah, no, that's not how I do it. Not unless somebody's got a very, very rigorous process, but usually they're not bringing in a consultant to help them sort something out because they know this thing's dialed.
Yeah,
Right.
So basically then you kind of start with pen, paper, draw out your assumption, start interviewing. And once you have a pretty good handle on what's happening, go invest in a piece of software. They're not terribly expensive. Microsoft has tools that do it, but there's all kinds of them where you can actually then get in and document your steps out. And if you build that out and realize that you have some complexity in there that you don't understand, honestly, I'm going to give a very shameless plug to your brother, Taylor, but Carry On Intelligence is like literally a software that's designed to validate your assumption on this and to help you optimize it. So like if you get in there and you create that wireframe and you think it's happening this way, go layer on a tool like Carry On Intelligence and see if that's true. See how many steps that you are actually in your process that you didn't realize were there, and that honestly probably aren't even value add. You could just axe and nobody wouldn't be the wiser. You know, there's probably a lot of that. So, but it all starts like before you do any kind of test on your operations, you have to have a hypothesis. Like, what do I think it's doing? What do I think it should be doing? And then kind of breaking it down with interviews from there.
I'm going to be quiet for a minute so other people can ask questions. So unmute yourself. I don't want to monologue anymore.
And to your point, Casey, if you would like to talk more about it, you can reach out to myself or Scott or Phil anytime after the call. We'd be happy to give you a 30-minute brainstorming session and see what we could do to help you.
So I have a quick question for Scott. Wrote in one of the questions. It's important to keep in mind the difference between value added and non-value added activities. And I just want to get some clarity there, because how do you measure that when it might be unseen value added?
Unseen value added, meaning the customer cares
So we're
about.
talking a process. Yeah, or it's required, and you might not know it's
Okay.
required. So to go from a deal that takes 2 months to go to a deal that takes 3 weeks, there might be something on your customer's end that you're not realizing. Hey, there's no process here to actually work towards a sale, and they're having to create processes on their end. But you would never capture that in a value add process, right? Because it doesn't necessarily add value to you because you can't see it. So I'm trying to figure out, how would you determine what's value added versus non-value added?
Yeah, if the customer cares about it, like extra inspection on a product, for example, that's value added, even though it's not changing a product like, machining or molding or something like that. So you really have to be really careful to define all the customer requirements, and that could be a living document. You don't want to get into scope creep or something like that, but it's part of your, the initial scope of work or contract agreement. But ultimately, the customer, what they want. That's the market requirements. So you have to listen to the voice of the customer. When you get into the value stream mapping type techniques, like Garett said, you have to have a hypothesis. One of the things I've seen work really well is you just take a big whiteboard, like a huge 8-foot by 4-foot whiteboard, and you give the whole team sticky notes, and you come in there and they just go crazy, and you just start putting sticky notes up and document the current state. The current state is the big spider web, the messy process. People may not agree with one another, but ultimately it might take all day, but you could get to the point where the whole team agrees on what the current state is. And some people may learn some things. They may discover a process they weren't doing. But if you connect the dots with sticky notes on a whiteboard, then you can say, okay, this is the current state. This is what it looks like. This is what the team agrees on. And then you can take the next step, which would be designing the future state, cutting out all the waste, reducing the cycle time between steps, shortening the lead time of the whole process. There's a whole bunch of techniques that can be used to do that, whether they're software apps or just Excel or, Microsoft Office type product. Anyway, hopefully that helped.
And to your question, Krista, what does the finished product look like? Honestly, it can be a pretty onerous document. It depends on how complicated your process delivery is. If you're if you're in a gun manufacturer, as an example, there's probably like 30 or 40 components in that gun. And so you, believe it or not, there's a fairly sophisticated process flow to build one, right? And get it all sort of manufactured and put together. There's a lot of compliance steps too. That might not fit on a PowerPoint slide. You might need several pages. There's softwares you can use that do it, but ultimately you can break down pieces of it into PowerPoint slides or whatever. But if all it is a list of tasks or a diagram, then you've won. Personally, I prefer a diagram versus a list. So if I were you, I would be thinking about how do I draw it out? Like literally, that's what the wireframe is and what we were talking about today anyway. Like step 1 is a box that does this. Step 2 is a box that does this. Step 3 is a box that does this. And then it bifurcates. And then there's a feedback loop. And then there's 5 other steps and so on. Literally draw it out. It'll be a quite enlightening process for you.
How do you convert that process to KPIs or a dashboard that you can then manage?
That's what I was referencing on the KPI side. It's very easy to measure everything and anything. And this is exactly what you do not want to do. This will make your life miserable if you do that. You want to identify the most critical tasks along that journey, the critical pathway. This is generally places where you have the longest lead times to the next step. It's where backlogs creep up. It's where you consistently hear problems in your process. And when you start drawing it out, it becomes pretty easy to see. That was the slide I showed you with the customer of ours that had that massive spider web, right? They had that massive spider web, and at the end, their critical process literally had like 6 or 7 steps in it. That's it. And when they started mastering that, they took themselves to the next level. So what you want to look at those critical steps are like, it depends on the step. If you're more that input and requirements and procuring resources phase, then guess what? Those steps are going to look like cost per unit. It's going to look like dollars per hour for an employee. It's going to look like, whatever the input factors into the system, right? When you actually start conducting those steps, it might be things like time to complete this step. How many widgets did so-and-so complete at this step? Versus capacity, right? How many hours does my employee spend on this step? Things like this, things that tell you how well they're pushing stuff through the system, right? And what you're really looking for more than anything is a backlog, because a backlog indicates a critical step. So you want to identify backlogs. And then as you move through that, you're going to get to the end result, and the end result are all going to be kind of like compliance checks. They're all going to be like validations of what you did. Like it's going to be like error rates. It's going to be customer feedback, like net promoter scores, stuff like this, right? And then ultimately, because I'm a financial guy, it's going to be all of your financial metrics, return on asset, net profit, days in AR, all that kind of stuff. Those are all the output figures at the end, right? So that's kind of an idea about what to look for along those steps.
Thanks, Phil. I appreciate that.
So you want to learn how to manage bottlenecks and the KPIs associated with them. This is like the Bible of it. And it's written, I don't know if anybody's ever read this book, but it's written in story form. So this is what manufacturing people use this, but it applies to processes and Garett was talking about, bottlenecks or things building up in a process. When something's stuck at a process, that's a critical path, you've got a problem. This book talks about how they chase it down. And it's in like 1970s lingo. So they're all smoking in the boardroom and everything. It's very strange, but the methodology doesn't change.
The final thing I will say about this is your set of KPIs should be relatively small. You do not want 30 KPIs or 40 KPIs or 50 KPIs. You want like sub 10, like seriously, like something that you can manage from. If you have a KPI set that's bigger than that, you've overworked it and you've done too much and you're going to be distracting people. You want like sub 10 steps or sub 10 measurables.
Awesome. Well, I think, Garett, this has been super helpful. We're at our time that we typically end. I would say I had a request last week that we either leave the room open for a little while so people can continue to network. So I'm going to do that. I haven't figured out how to make breakout rooms by industry or anything like that. That'll be my Zoom homework for this week. But I'll stop recording right now. And Garett, thanks so much for your time. Scott, your input was fantastic. Really appreciate this. I am also getting the recordings to a point where we can post them on a website. So that's another just late night homework assignment, but it'll come, I promise. So thanks so much, Garett. Really appreciate it. Thanks everyone. And feel free to stick around and meet new people and keep talking for a little while.